Far to the north of Tamriel, across the restless sea of ghosts, lies a land now spoken of only in fragments and fading songs. Atmora, the old homeland, a place of wind-swept glaciers, of forests heavy with frost, of rivers choked with ice. In the long memory of men, it was a realm both beloved and cruel, where winter reigned without end. It was there that Ysgramor was born, a child of a stern people who endured the harshness of the land with iron spirit. Life in Atmora was not gentle. The summers were short, and even in their warmth, the air carried a chill. The soil yielded little, and men survived by strength of arm, by the hunt, and by bonds of kinship. Yet even in such hardship, there was greatness. In the halls of the Atmorans, fires burned against the dark, and the voices of storytellers wove memory into song. Ysgramor listened to these stories as a youth, tales of the dawn, when gods and spirits walked more freely upon the earth. He heard of battles that shaped the world, and of heroes whose names echoed like thunder across frozen valleys. From those tales, a seed was planted, the dream of lands beyond, of horizons yet unseen. As he grew, Ysgramor was known as a leader of strong will and sharper vision. He was not merely content with the endurance of his people, with their endless struggle against winter's bite. His gaze turned often to the southern seas, where the horizon shimmered with promise. He would stand upon the icebound shore, the wind pulling at his cloak, and speak of warmer lands, places where forests stretched unbroken, where the earth was fertile, and where men could build something greater than survival. Some among his kin listened, while others dismissed his words as dreaming. Atmora was their cradle, the place of their ancestors, and to leave it seemed a betrayal of blood. Yet to others, weary of the ceaseless cold, his vision was a spark in the long night. They began to gather around him, men and women of stout hearts, who shared his longing for more than frozen endurance. It was not only hardship that stirred this desire. In Atmora, strife among clans was unending. Wars of honor, of insult, of vengeance, small matters that flared into bloodshed. Ysgramor looked upon these quarrels and saw futility. He sought a land where his people might begin anew, unburdened by the endless feuds of the north. So it was that the thought of departure grew from dream into plan. Ships were built upon Atmora's rugged coasts, vessels shaped from the hard timber of the land. Each was a gift of labor and sacrifice, for the forests of Atmora were sparse, and every felled tree carried the weight of a people's hope. By firelight, men bent planks into shape, sealing them with pitch, while women wove sails from rough-spun cloth. Children watched in wonder, scarcely able to imagine the voyage that lay ahead. The sea itself was no gentler than the land. The Sea of Ghosts had long been feared, for its waters were cruel, and storms rose without warning. Yet Ysgramor's followers trusted in him, believing his vision of a land across the waves. Each completed ship was christened with solemn words, the names of ancestors spoken aloud, as if to carry their spirits into the voyage. In those days, Ysgramor himself was tireless. He walked among his people, lifting burdens, offering encouragement. His voice was deep and steady, carrying assurance like the warmth of a hearth. He did not speak of conquest, nor of glory. He spoke of shelter, of fertile fields, of a home where children could laugh without fear of famine. And in the hearts of those who followed, his words became as binding as oaths. When the time came at last, the shores of Atmora saw a sight not witnessed before, a fleet, small but resolute, ready to sail into the unknown. The wind carried the scent of salt and ice, and gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the morning air. Families gathered at the water's edge, some to depart, others to watch loved ones vanish into destiny. There were tears, but also pride. Ysgramor stood at the prow of the lead ship, Wuthrad not yet forged, but already his presence was that of a legend. His eyes did not linger on what was left behind, but on the horizon, the line where sea met sky, and where hope met the unknown. Thus began the great departure, a voyage that would forever alter the shape of history. With sails unfurled and oars cutting the waters, the Atmorans followed Ysgramor south toward the hidden coasts of Tamriel. The land of their birth dwindled behind them, its peaks fading into mist until Atmora became but a memory, and before them stretched a future yet unwritten. The voyage south was long, and the sea of ghosts was merciless. Days bled into nights, and the horizon was ever shifting, the line of sky and water forever blurred by mist. The Atmorans rowed in silence, their oars dipping in rhythm, while the wind sighed through the sails like a voice from the beyond. Yet though the sea was treacherous, the hearts of those who sailed with Ysgramor were steady. They sang softly in the night, their voices rising and falling like the waves themselves. Old songs of Atmora were woven into new refrains of hope, and in the darkness, children clung to mothers and fathers who whispered of a land where the snow did not bury every harvest. These whispers were not boasts of conquest, nor tales of plunder, but gentle promises, words meant to lull the young into sleep against the rocking of the ships. Ysgramor himself kept watch each night, pacing the deck as the stars wheeled above. The constellations were the same as those of Atmora, but their alignment shifted as the fleet pressed southward. To Ysgramor, this was a sign, the heavens themselves turning with the course of their destiny. He spoke often with his most trusted companions, men who would one day be remembered not merely as shipmates, but as founders of a new people. Among them was his son Ingall, stern yet kind, whose gaze held the same distant fire as his father's. And there was Ilger, brother to Ingall, strong of arm and swift of thought, who carried with him a joy that lightened even the most solemn of nights. Others, whose names would fade into the long roll of the 500, shared the burden of command and the promise of new life. At last, after weeks of hardship, the sea of ghosts relented. A gray dawn broke, and the mist parted to reveal a coastline vast and untamed. Forests dark, and endless stretch from the mountains down to the water's edge. White peaks crowned the horizon, their slopes rising like guardians of a new land. For those who had never seen more than Atmora's frozen plains, the sight was overwhelming. The fleet anchored in a sheltered bay, where the water lay calm and clear. The Atmorans disembarked in silence, setting foot upon the soil of Tamriel for the first time. Some knelt and pressed their hands into the earth, marveling at its richness. Others gazed upward at the trees, taller than any they had known, their boughs heavy with needles that whispered in the wind. Ysgramor stood apart, his cloak stirring gently as he surveyed the new world. He did not cry out in triumph, nor raise his arms in boast. Instead, he breathed deeply, and his voice carried low and solemn when he spoke to his followers. Here shall we build, here shall we endure, and here shall our children know more than the hunger of Atmora's snows. So began the first days of settlement. The Atmorans felled trees and raised halls of timber, their axes echoing through the stillness of the forest. Fires were lit against the night, and laughter rose where before there had been only endurance. The land was harsh, but it was abundant, and the people worked with a vigor born of newfound hope. The first of these settlements was Sarthal, a place of wood and stone, simple yet strong. It rose upon a hillside overlooking both sea and forest, as though to keep watch over the path from which the Atmorans had come. In Sarthal, they found not only shelter, but belonging. Here, at last, it seemed they might carve a future free of the quarrels and the cold that had driven them from their homeland. It was not long, however, before they discovered they were not alone. The Snow Elves, fair and strange, dwelled in the hidden valleys and mountain halls of Skyrim. At first, their presence was a curiosity, and the Atmorans approached with caution. The elves, for their part, appeared distant yet not hostile. They watched from the shadows of the trees, their pale eyes gleaming, their words carried on the wind like half-heard songs. For a time, there was uneasy peace. The Atmorans tilled small fields and raised their halls higher, while the Snow Elves lingered at the edge of sight. Some whispered that the elves were ancient beyond reckoning, that they had seen the land shaped from the mists of creation itself. Others said that their beauty was but a mask, and that beneath it lay secrets best left untouched. But Ysgramor was not given to fear shadows. He welcomed what peace could be held, teaching his people to work, to build, and to root themselves in this new soil. Sarthel grew, and with it, the sense that the Atmorans had found not merely survival, but the first steps of destiny. Yet even as the fires of Sarthel glowed bright against the night, a silence lingered in the mountains. The Snow Elves watched, and in their gaze was something unreadable. Neither open friendship nor open war, but a waiting stillness, deep as the falling snow. And so the first chapter of Ysgramor's tale in Tamriel was written, not with sword and shield, but with hope, with labor, and with the fragile peace of two peoples whose paths had crossed beneath the same stars. In the earliest days upon Tamriel's shores, every sunrise felt like a gift. The Atmorans woke to birdsong they had never heard before, and the rustle of forests alive with creatures unlike any they had hunted in their northern homeland. The air was cool, yet gentler than Atmora's breath, and the earth beneath their feet was dark and fertile, for men who had known only the bite of frost and the thin soil of the north. It was as though they had stepped into a dream given form. Sarthel rose slowly, but with purpose. Great timbers were cut from the surrounding woods, their bark stripped and their frames bound together into long halls. These were halls not only of shelter, but of kinship, where families gathered around firelight, and the voices of storytellers echoed against the beams. In every home, the walls whispered of hope, and the crackling flames spoke of permanence, a future rooted in the land. The people divided their labor with quiet resolve. Some cleared fields at the forest's edge, turning earth that had lain untouched for ages. The soil yielded grudgingly at first, but seeds took root, and green shoots rose beneath the sun. Others set traps and wandered into the wilds, learning the ways of Skyrim's beasts, elk that moved like shadows through the trees, and saber cats whose eyes glowed in the dark. Each discovery brought new lessons, for this was a land that demanded respect as much as it offered abundance. Ysgramor walked often among the people, his presence a steady reassurance. He did not sit apart like a lord upon a throne, but bent his back beside them, lifting timbers and shaping stone. His words were few, but when he spoke, they lingered in memory, reminders of why they had left Atmora and what they sought to build here. His sons, Ingol and Ilger, were never far, guiding work with strength and laughter, earning the loyalty of those who labored by their side. And yet, even in those days of industry and hope, the Atmorans were aware of eyes upon them. The Snow Elves, the Famur as they would one day be named, moved quietly through the forests and hills. Pale and tall, they appeared seldom, but their presence was felt in every shadow and in every half-heard sound of the treeling. Some Atmorans told of glimpses, a figure vanishing into mist, or eyes gleaming faintly by moonlight. At first, the elves gave no cause for alarm. A few approached, their voices soft as wind, their speech flowing like water. They bore no weapons, and their faces were calm, though unreadable. Ysgramor welcomed them with the courtesy of a guest, though he knew little of their intent. Gifts were exchanged. Carved ornaments of Elven make for rough tokens of Atmoran craft. And for a time, the settlement breathed easier, as though peace might truly be possible. But trust was not easily given. The Atmorans, hardy and suspicious, wondered what the elves truly thought of them. And the elves, ancient beyond reckoning, looked upon these new settlers with eyes that seemed to weigh more than words could carry. The Atmorans were loud, their fires burned high, and their axes rang through forests that had stood for ages. To the Snow Elves, who had lived in quiet harmony with the land, it must have seemed as though a storm had descended from the sea. Still, no open quarrel arose. Sarthel grew, its walls rising stronger, its fires glowing brighter against the long nights. Children laughed in its courtyards, running between halls where once there had been only wilderness. Men and women sang songs of Atmora and of Tamriel both, weaving old memory with new life. For the first time, the Atmorans began to believe they had truly found more than exile. They had found belonging. Ysgramor, gazing upon the settlement from the heights of its walls, spoke to his sons of what Sarthel might become. "This is but a beginning," he said, his voice low and steady. "From this hall, a people shall rise. The snows will not hinder us, nor the shadows of the mountains. Here we will carve a place for our children's children, and their names shall echo beyond the span of our years." The words carried like a promise, and the people held them close. Sarthel was not merely a settlement of wood and stone, but the heart of a new age, the first true home of men upon the soil of Skyrim. And yet, though hope burned bright in those early days, the silence of the Snow Elves lingered, watching, waiting, their intentions hidden, their patience endless. As the seasons turned, the people of Sarthel grew more certain of their new home. Smoke rose each morning from hearths, drifting in pale ribbons across the treetops. The laughter of children carried between the wooden halls, and the clang of hammers echoed where men shaped stone for stronger foundations. Slowly, the wilderness began to yield to the rhythm of Atmoran hands. The forest gave timber, the soil gave harvest, and the sea gave fish enough to fill the stores. It was a life still marked by labor, but no longer by the constant despair of Atmora's endless frost. For the first time, men spoke not only of survival, but of future generations, of children who might grow to know this land not as strangers, but as natives. Yet beneath the warmth of progress lingered the chill of uncertainty. For though Sarthel's walls grew stronger, the Snow Elves never withdrew. They were seldom seen, but often felt. Pale figures glimpsed at twilight, or voices carried faintly through the pines when no speaker could be found. At times, the Atmorans discovered tokens left near their settlement. Bundles of herbs bound with silver thread, or carved stones etched with unfamiliar symbols. To some, these were gifts, signs of cautious goodwill. To others, they were warnings, reminders that the Atmorans were guests in a land that was not theirs. Ysgramor counseled patience. He told his people that fear would only feed mistrust, and that the elves must be met with dignity, not suspicion. His words carried weight, but doubt remained. For the Snow Elves were unlike any foe or friend the Atmorans had known. Their beauty was cold, their speech strange, and their presence unsettling. It was said that their eyes gleamed with knowledge far older than men could grasp, as though they remembered ages when the world itself was still being sung into form. In the long nights of winter, stories grew. Around the fires of Sarthel, men whispered of hidden cities carved into mountains, where the elves walked in halls of crystal light. Some claimed the elves worshipped gods older and stranger than the divines, and that their songs could call the snows themselves to rise in fury. Others believed them to be guardians of Skyrim, bound to the land in ways men could not comprehend. And always behind the stories lay the same unease, the sense of being watched, measured, and judged. Still, daily life pressed onward. Fields were planted again in spring, and the settlement spread wider. Small shrines rose at Sarthel's heart, where men gave thanks for safe passage across the sea of ghosts and prayed for peace in the seasons ahead. There was joy, too, in weddings celebrated and in children born beneath the unfamiliar constellations of Skyrim's sky. Sarthel became not only a place of refuge, but of beginnings. And yet, the bond with the Snow Elves never deepened. They did not join in feasts, nor linger by fires. They kept to the margins, their presence an unspoken reminder of distance. At times they offered counsel, a warning of storms, or guidance to a river rich with fish, but always they vanished as swiftly as they appeared, like mist dissolving with the dawn. For Ysgramor, this delicate balance was both a blessing and a shadow. He believed his people could thrive here, but he also knew that two peoples so different could not remain strangers forever. He often stood upon the walls of Sarthel at night, watching the forests beyond the firelight. His sons asked what he saw in the darkness, but his only answer was silence. The settlement prospered, but it prospered under a sky heavy with unseen weight. For every timber raised, there was a whisper of eyes beyond the tree-line. For every child born, a reminder that others had walked these lands long before men's arrival. Sarthel's fires glowed bright, but beyond their circle stretched a vast and patient stillness. Thus the Atmorans entered the second season of their dwelling in Skyrim. Their roots grew deeper, their songs louder, their dreams brighter. Yet the elves remained silent and watchful, and the peace that held between them was fragile as frost upon a dawn leaf, waiting for the first warmth to melt it away. As the years passed, Sarthel grew strong, and yet a shadow deepened over its walls. The Atmorans lived with diligence, their halls filled with warmth and song. But in the spaces between those moments of joy, silence gathered like snow upon the eaves. It was the silence of watchful eyes, of unspoken judgment, and of histories men did not yet understand. The Snow Elves, the true children of Skyrim, remained near but never close. They walked the forest with quiet steps, their pale forms seen only in glimpses, as if the land itself concealed them. At times, they appeared with measured courtesy, speaking in voices as calm as still water. Their words were soft, their gestures graceful, yet always there was distance, as though a veil lay between the two peoples. To the Atmorans, these elves seemed more spirit than flesh. Their features were sharp and luminous, their eyes reflecting the moonlight with an otherworldly glow. They spoke of ancient mountains and rivers as though they were kin, and of stars as though they were memories rather than distant fires. When they touched the earth, it was with reverence, as though every stone carried a story far older than the tread of man. At first, the Atmorans admired them with a kind of wonder. In the long nights, storytellers in Sarthel wove tales of the elves, of halls carved deep within the ice, lit by crystal lamps that never dimmed, of knowledge written not upon parchment, but upon the winds and the waters themselves. To hear these stories was to believe the elves lived in harmony with mysteries beyond the reach of men. But with admiration came unease, for the elves spoke little of themselves and less of their gods. They hinted at powers vast and subtle, but never gave full answers. Their songs, when sung, carried sorrow rather than joy, as though remembering ages lost. To the Atmorans, who were open in speech and plain in manner, this secrecy was unsettling. What truths did the elves guard? What meaning lay behind their silence? Some Atmorans began to mistrust the pale folk. They whispered that the elves resented their presence, that behind their calm faces lay envy or disdain. Others argued the opposite, that the elves pitied them, seeing men as children clumsy with tools, unready to shape the land they now claimed. Both thoughts gnawed at the hearts of Sarthel's people. For every harvest gathered, for every hall raised, the question remained, what do the elves truly intend? Ysgramor, wise though he was, could not answer. He counseled his people to patience, reminding them that peace was fragile and must be tended like a flame. Yet even he, when he looked into the eyes of the Snow Elves, felt the weight of ages pressing against him. It was as though he stood before beings who remembered the birth of the mountains, and who looked upon men as passing travelers in a world not yet theirs. Still, Sarthel thrived. Children grew, seasons turned, and men's songs filled the air. But beneath that growth a rift widened. The elves watched as forests fell to men's axes, as new fields were cleared, as firelight spread where once there had been only stars. To them, this must have seemed a wound upon the land. To the Atmorans, it was survival, the fulfillment of Ysgramor's vision. The balance between them was delicate, like ice upon a thawing river. And though no open blade had yet been drawn, the air carried tension unspoken, a quiet sense that the peace could not endure. Sarthel, proud and growing, had become more than a settlement. It had become a symbol, proof that men had come to stay. And in that truth lay the seed of sorrow, sorrow that would bloom in fire and blood, in a night remembered forever as the night of tears. It was in the deep of winter that the stillness finally broke. Sarthel, resting beneath blankets of snow, seemed secure in its quiet labors. Fires glowed in every hall, and laughter still warmed the cold nights. Yet beyond the walls, in the forests where shadows stretched long, the Snow Elves gathered with purpose unspoken. Their patience, so long enduring, had ended. No chronicler of men can say with certainty what drove them. Some claim envy, that the elves feared the strength of men, the swiftness with which they grew. Others whisper of secrets hidden beneath Sarthel itself, treasures or truths too great for mortals to hold. Still others believe it was not malice, but sorrow twisted into wrath. The sorrow of a people who felt their land slipping away, taken root by root, stone by stone. Whatever the cause, their choice was made, and the peace was broken. The attack came in silence, as snow fell heavy upon the roofs of Sarthel. The elves moved like ghosts through the night, their forms pale against the white earth, their blades gleaming like shards of ice. They struck swiftly, their arrows piercing the dark, their voices raised not in warning, but in cries that chilled the blood. The Atmorans awoke to fire and confusion. Smoke rose into the night sky, carried on the wind with the sound of shouts and steel. Families fled into the snow, clutching children, their cries drowned by the clash of battle. Men seized axes and spears, but they were unprepared, for the elves struck with numbers and fury beyond reckoning. The halls that had been built with such hope became pyres, their timbers crackling as flames devoured them. Amid the chaos, Ysgramor fought to gather his people. With his sons beside him, he cut through the night, his voice carrying above the din, calling for retreat. Yet even as he fought, his heart broke, for Sarthel was more than wood and stone. It was the promise of a future. To see it undone in a single night was to feel the weight of despair heavier than any blade. The snow itself seemed to betray them. It fell thick, blinding the eyes, muffling the sound of flight. Paths vanished, and many stumbled into the dark, never to rise again. Ysgramor pressed onward, guiding as many as he could toward the coast, where the ships lay waiting. But each step was marked by loss, each cry behind him a reminder of lives that could not be saved. When at last they reached the sea, only a remnant remained. Behind them, Sarthel burned, its glow casting a dreadful light across the horizon. The cries of the fallen echoed still in the hearts of those who survived, and the snow was stained with sorrow that no tide could wash away. In silence, Ysgramor turned his ships northward, back across the Sea of Ghosts. The people of Sarthel, broken and grieving, left behind the ashes of their first home. The sea swallowed their tears, and the wind carried their grief. For Ysgramor, it was not only exile, it was a wound carved deep into his soul, a promise of vengeance and remembrance. Thus ended the first chapter of Men in Skyrim, not with triumph, but with tragedy. Sarthel, once the beacon of hope, became a memory shrouded in flame and sorrow. And the survivors, adrift upon the restless sea, carried with them both despair and resolve. For though they had been broken, they were not destroyed. In the heart of Ysgramor, grief hardened into purpose. He would not let the night of tears be the end of his people's story. From loss would rise resolve, from ashes would rise vengeance, and from exile would rise a saga that the snows themselves would never forget. The ships that carried Ysgramor and his people back across the Sea of Ghosts reached the shores of Atmora in silence. There was no song to greet their return, no triumph in their arrival. Where once they had departed with laughter and hope, now they came home with sorrow heavy as stone. The fires of Sarthel still seemed to glow in their eyes, and the cries of the fallen lingered in their ears. Atmora received them as it always had, with cold winds and unyielding frost. Yet even the bitterness of that land felt gentler than the memory of loss. Families who had remained behind gathered at the coast to welcome their kin, only to weep at the emptiness among them. Too many had been left in Skyrim, their graves unmarked, their stories unfinished. Ysgramor bore their grief as his own, and his silence weighed upon all who looked to him for guidance. But sorrow did not remain idle within him. In the heart of Ysgramor, grief turned to iron and despair to resolve. He walked among the halls of Atmora, calling upon chieftains, thanes, and warriors. To each he spoke of Sarthel's fall, of the treachery of the Snow Elves, and of the need for vengeance. His words were not shouted, nor adorned with boasts. They were steady, measured, heavy with truth. He did not speak of conquest for glory, but of justice, of remembrance, of the duty owed to the dead. And the people listened. Men and women hardened by Atmora's winters felt the fire of his grief as though it were their own. They saw in him not only a leader, but a vessel of their shared sorrow and pride. Slowly, one by one, they pledged themselves to his cause. They swore oaths by their ancestors, by the snows of Atmora, by the stars that shone above both lands. They would follow Ysgramor to Tamriel, to reclaim what had been lost, and to carve a future in the blood of their enemies. The call spread across Atmora, carried from hall to hall, from fjord to mountain vale. Warriors came forth in numbers greater than any had foreseen. Some came for vengeance, others for honor, others still for the dream of a homeland freer than Atmora's harsh embrace. They brought with them axes and swords, shields marked with runes, and banners dyed in deep colors. Each was a soul bound to Ysgramor's vision, each a voice in the swelling chorus of resolve. In time, the gathering became legend. They were called the 500 Companions, though their numbers were many times that in spirit. They were not bound by coin, nor by promise of riches, but by loyalty to Ysgramor and to one another. Their oaths were simple: to avenge Sarthel, to reclaim Skyrim, and to carve their place upon Tamriel's snows with unshakable will. The forging of their brotherhood was marked by fire and feasting. Great halls rang with the sound of drinking horns, and warriors clasped hands in bonds of fellowship. Yet even in their celebration, there was solemnity, for they knew the road ahead would be steep and many would not return. Still, none wavered. Each oath was spoken as if carved in stone, each promise as enduring as the mountains of Atmora. At the heart of this storm stood Ysgramor, tall and steady, his voice carrying over the throng. He did not raise himself above his companions, but stood among them, a man who shared their burdens. When he spoke of the journey to come, his words were not of hatred alone, but of remembrance, that the fallen of Sarthel should not be forgotten, that their sacrifice would be the foundation upon which new life would rise. Thus the 500 were gathered, a tide of resolve bound to one leader's vision. Atmora, once their cradle, became too small for their purpose. Their eyes turned once more to the south, across the restless sea, toward the land where sorrow had been sown. And this time, they vowed they would not come as settlers, but as warriors, a storm upon the snows, a flame to answer the night of tears. When the companions were gathered and their oaths spoken, preparations for the great voyage began. Along the coasts of Atmora, the sound of hammers and axes rang like thunder. Shipwrights labored day and night, felling timber and shaping vessels strong enough to brave the sea of ghosts. The memory of Sarthel's burning gave weight to every strike, for these were not mere ships. They were vessels of vengeance, the carriers of an oath bound in grief and fire. The fleet grew vast, greater than any seen in living memory. Long ships lined the icy bays, their hulls dark against the snow, their sails woven from thick cloth strong enough to catch the fiercest winds. Each vessel bore carvings upon its prow, serpents, wolves, and dragons, symbols of power and guardianship. The warriors who would ride them painted shields in bold colors, inscribing runes that spoke of ancestors and of the battles yet to come. Before their departure, great feasts were held. Fires blazed within the halls, casting shadows that danced upon the walls. Horns were raised, songs were sung, and tales of Sarthel were told again and again. Yet these were not songs of despair. They were songs of defiance, of bonds renewed, of vengeance promised. The laughter was deep and fierce, and the silence between verses carried the gravity of what lay ahead. In those halls, Ysgramor walked among his people. His presence was steady, his voice a calm flame amid the roar of celebration. He spoke not of hatred, but of remembrance. He reminded them of the fallen, of fathers, mothers, and children whose lives have been torn away in a night of sorrow. "We sail not for conquest alone," he told them, his words carrying into every corner. "We sail so that their names shall not vanish into silence. We sail so that no man may say the people of Sarthel lived and died in vain." When the morning came, the fleet gathered upon the waters. The air was sharp with salt and frost, the sea restless beneath a pale sky. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder upon the decks, their armor glinting, their cloaks snapping in the wind. The voices of thousands rose together, not in a shout of rage, but in a steady chant, an oath to the gods, to the land, and to one another. It was said that even the waves fell silent to listen, as though the sea itself bore witness to their vow. And so they set forth, oars dipped in perfect rhythm, and sails swelled with the wind. The longships cut through the icy waters, their prows rising and falling like the heartbeat of the fleet. The sea of ghosts tested them with storms, with waves that towered like mountains, with winds that screamed like spirits. Yet the companions endured. Their voices rose in song, steady and unyielding, a defiance that matched the fury of the waters. Ysgramor stood at the prow of the lead ship, his cloak whipping in the gale. His gaze never faltered, fixed upon the horizon where Tamriel lay hidden. Around him stood his sons, Ingol and Ilger, and the greatest of his companions. Together, they spoke oaths upon the wind, oaths that their axes would not rest, their shields would not falter, and their spirits would not waver until Sarthel was avenged and Skyrim reclaimed. For days and nights uncounted, the fleet pressed on. Stars guided them, storms battered them, and still they rode. And at last, when the mists parted and the peaks of Skyrim rose once more upon the horizon, a great silence fell among them. It was not the silence of fear, but of awe, the stillness of men who beheld the land of destiny. Thus came Ysgramor and the 500 companions to the shores of Skyrim, not as weary settlers, but as a storm of vengeance. The sea behind them roared, the mountains before them loomed, and their saga was only beginning. The fleet of Ysgramor reached the northern shores of Skyrim as dawn broke across a pale sky. The sea mist clung to their ships like shrouds, and the mountains loomed high above, crowned in white. For many of the companions, it was their first sight of Tamriel, but for Ysgramor, it was the return to a land once lost. His heart stirred with memories of Sarthel, of halls built in hope and burned in sorrow. Now he stepped upon the sand not as a settler, but as a conqueror, bearing oaths sealed by fire and grief. The landing was met not by silence, but by resistance. The Snow Elves had not forgotten the men of Atmora, nor the ruin left in their wake. Watchers among the cliffs had seen the sails upon the horizon, and word carried swiftly through their hidden paths. Arrows fell from the heights like rain, their shafts hissing through the morning air. Yet the companions did not falter. Shields rose in unison, a wall of oak and iron, and the fleet answered with the thunder of voices. From the decks, warriors surged forth, leaping into the shallow surf, their axes gleaming as the sun struck their blades. The clash came swiftly, the roar of men rising to meet the cries of elves. Yet though the Snow Elves struck with precision, they found their fury met with greater force. For every arrow loosed, a shield pressed forward. For every blade drawn, an axe answered with unyielding weight. The shore became a maelstrom of sound, the crash of waves, the ring of steel, the shouts of defiance. But though the battle burned fierce, there was no chaos among the companions. They fought as one, bound by their oaths, moving with the rhythm of a single heartbeat. Their shields locked together, their axes rose and fell like the tide. The Snow Elves, swift and graceful, found themselves pressed back by sheer determination. Amid the struggle, Ysgramor strode like a figure of legend. His axe gleamed with each swing, and his voice carried above the din, steady and commanding. Around him, his sons fought with equal resolve. Ingol fierce as the storm, Ilger swift as the wind. They carved paths through the fray, not for glory, but to anchor their people's advance. Each step forward was a declaration that men had returned and that their roots would take hold in Skyrim once more. As the day lengthened, the tide of battle shifted. The elves, though cunning and swift, could not withstand the unyielding press of 500 oaths embodied in steel and shield. Step by step, they were driven back from the shore, their retreat marked not by shouts of victory, but by the silence of grim determination. The companions did not cheer as the beach was taken. They raised no cries of triumph. Instead, they stood in quiet resolve, knowing that this was only the beginning. When the sun set, its last light falling across the restless sea, the shore lay claimed by the companions. Fires were kindled, wounds were tended, and the dead were given to the waves with solemn words. Ysgramor stood upon the sands, gazing southward, his thoughts heavy. This land was vast, filled with both promise and peril. To claim it would demand more than strength of arms. It would demand endurance, unity, and sacrifice beyond measure. Thus was the first battle of return, not a conquest in full, but the opening of a storm that would sweep across Skyrim. The shore, once silent, now bore the mark of men once more. And in the hearts of the companions, the fire of their purpose burned brighter than ever, for the blood shed upon that beach bound their oaths tighter still. With the northern shore secured, the companions pressed inland. The land of Skyrim stretched before them, vast and untamed, its valleys deep with pine and its peaks crowned in snow. The forests whispered with ancient voices, and the mountains stood like guardians, watching the movements of men who dared return. For many among the companions, each step inland was like walking into a dream, a place both strange and familiar, filled with beauty, yet haunted by the memory of betrayal. Scouts moved ahead, their eyes sharp for signs of the Snow Elves. The enemy did not wait in open fields, nor did they confront the companions with armies. Instead, they struck from shadows, arrows loose from the high branches, stones rolled from cliffs, ambushes sprung upon narrow trails. The elves knew the land as their own blood, and they wove its dangers into their defense. To the men of Atmora, every path seemed to carry risk, every glade a hidden watcher. Yet the 500 did not falter. For every ambush, their shields locked tight. For every arrow, a shield rose in answer. Their patience was as enduring as the stone beneath their boots, and their resolve burned as steadily as the fires they lit each night. They sang low songs as they marched, voices deep and steady, not for triumph but to bind their spirits in unity. In those songs, grief was carried, and through grief came strength. The Snow Elves, though cunning, found themselves pressed back, their numbers dwindling in the face of relentless advance. Where they fled, the companions followed. Villages hidden in the hollows of the mountains were discovered, their white hulls glittering in the moonlight. Some were abandoned before the companions arrived, their fires cold, their inhabitants vanished into deeper shadows. Others resisted, raising slender blades and calling upon ancient magics. But the axes of Atmora fell with purpose, and their resistance, though fierce, was broken. Yet Ysgramor did not take joy in the ruin left behind. Each conquered place was marked not by celebration, but by solemn remembrance. Fires were kindled not only to warm the companions, but to honor those who had fallen at Sarthal. His words each evening were measured, reminding his warriors that they did not march to destroy alone, but to build anew. He spoke of halls yet to be raised, of families yet to flourish, of Skyrim as a land where their descendants might live free of fear. As the companions pressed further south, the Snow Elves retreated deeper into their strongholds. They abandoned the open paths and fled into caverns, temples, and hidden cities carved from the bones of the mountains. The land itself seemed to swallow them, as if Skyrim conspired to shield its first children. But Ysgramor's host was relentless, and their march echoed across valleys and rivers, a steady drumbeat of determination. And so the legend of the first battle spread. Tales whispered of men who marched through storms without pause, who met ambush with laughter, who bore wounds as though they were no more than scratches. Among the elves, fear began to stir, for they saw that the men of Atmora were not fleeting shadows. They were a tide rising with unshakable force. Thus, the March of the 500 became more than vengeance. It became the shaping of destiny, the carving of a place in the stone of Skyrim. Every step carried them deeper into the heart of the land. Every night bound them closer as one people. And though the path was long and filled with peril, none doubted the course. For the oaths sworn upon Atmora's shores still rang within them, clear as the clash of steel, steady as the heartbeat of the earth itself. As the march of the 500 carried deeper into Skyrim, the battles shifted from fleeting skirmishes to struggles of endurance. The Snow Elves, driven from the open fields and forest paths, withdrew into their hidden strongholds. There, in halls carved of white stone and crystal, they prepared to resist the tide of Atmora with all the cunning of their craft. Their citadels clung to mountainsides, their towers glimmered in the pale light, and their gates were wrought with enchantments older than memory. The first of these holds rose before the companions like a vision. Its walls shimmered faintly, as though the stones themselves held a light within. Bridges of narrow stone reached toward it across deep chasms, guarded by warriors robed in white, their blades catching the dawn. The companions beheld it in silence, for it seemed less a fortress than a dream. Yet they knew that behind those gates lay enemies who had once struck in treachery, and whose hands had set fire to Sarthel. The siege began not with roaring engines, but with patience. The companions built camps around the approaches, their fires burning bright against the cold cliffs. Scouts studied the walls, searching for weakness. Archers loosed volleys to test the defenders, while shield-bearers formed walls against the answering arrows. Days stretched into nights, and the air grew heavy with the stillness of waiting. The elves, secure in their high halls, rained down spells of frost and flame, but the shields of Atmora endured. In the quiet hours of evening, when the winds howled through the chasms, the companions sang. Their voices rolled like thunder through the valleys, deep and solemn, carrying the memory of Sarthel to the very gates of their foes. The Snow Elves answered with their own chants, high and haunting, a clash of song that echoed like battle itself. Thus the siege was waged not only with arms, but with spirit, each side testing the resolve of the other. At last, Ysgramor ordered the assault. Warriors advanced across the narrow bridges, shields raised, arrows hissing around them. The elves resisted with all their might, casting spells that turned the stones slick with ice and fire. Many fell into the depths below, swallowed by shadow. Yet still the companions pressed on, their axes biting into the gates, their shields locking against the storm. The clash was terrible, yet the tide could not be stemmed. Inch by inch, the gates splintered beneath the relentless blows. When at last they burst open, the companions poured through like a flood, voices raised in defiance. The halls of the Snow Elves rang with the echo of steel, and their crystal walls trembled with the weight of oaths fulfilled. By nightfall, the first hold had fallen. Fires burned in its courtyards, and the halls of the elves lay silent. The companions did not revel in the ruin. They walked through the shattered gates with solemn steps, for they knew each battle was only another stone laid upon the long road of vengeance. Ysgramor himself stood within the conquered hall, gazing upon its pale walls. "Here begins the breaking of their dominion," he said softly, "but our path stretches far yet." Thus the first of the Snow Elf strongholds was claimed, not in triumph, but in the steady fulfillment of an oath. The march of the 500 had grown heavier, but their resolve shone brighter still. For in each victory, the shadow of Sarthel seemed to lift, piece by piece, though its memory never faded. The fall of the first Snow Elf hold did not mark an end, but a beginning. As the embers of its fires dimmed, scouts returned with tidings of other strongholds scattered through the mountains. Some lay hidden in valleys where rivers ran like silver threads. Others carved high into peaks where even the eagle feared to soar. Each was a sanctuary, a fortress of white stone and shimmering light, raised by hands that had known this land for countless ages. For the companions, each stood as a barrier against their return, and each was destined to be tested by their oath. The marches grew longer, the battles more grueling. Where once the Snow Elves struck swiftly and fled, they now stood within their walls, fighting with desperation. Their arrows fell in storms, their spells turned night to day, and their cries echoed across the mountains. Yet the 500 endured, their shields scarred but unbroken, their axes dull but unyielding. They pressed onward with the patience of stone, each step a promise that no fortress, however radiant, could withstand their resolve. At the second hold, the companions faced gates bound not only with stone, but with wards of ancient power. Walls glimmered with runes that turned blades aside, and towers sang with voices of frost. For days the companions battered the gates, only to see their blows swallowed by enchantment. But Ysgramor would not be turned. At his command, they dragged the trees of the surrounding forest, fashioning rams and towers. When the moon rose pale above the peaks, they surged forward, their axes rising in unison. The gates trembled, cracked, and at last burst beneath their combined might. The halls within shone with crystal light, dazzling even the battle-hardened eyes of Atmora. But beauty could not shield against oaths. The companions swept through the passages, their voices echoing like thunder. The elves resisted fiercely, their blades gleaming like moonlight, but they were few, and the weight of the 500 pressed down upon them. By dawn, the second hold had fallen, its white towers silent, its runes fading into dust. Each victory bore a cost. The marches left men weary, and the battles claimed lives with cruel certainty. Yet Ysgramor spoke each night by the fire, his voice low and steady. He reminded his warriors of Sarthel, of the kin who slept beneath its ruins, of the blood that cried out for remembrance. His words were not of conquest alone, but of home, of a land where their children might walk free, unafraid of betrayal. These words steadied hearts and bound spirits, so that even in grief, the companions did not falter. Thus the pattern repeated. Stronghold after stronghold fell, each marked not by celebration, but by solemn firelight. The elves, once proud and unyielding, grew fewer with each loss, their dominion crumbling like frost before the morning sun. Still they fought, graceful even in despair, but the tide of Atmora pressed inexorably forward. And in every hall they claimed, the companions left their mark, not in cruelty, but in the silent weight of vengeance fulfilled. By the season's turn, the name of Ysgramor and his 500 was whispered in every valley of Skyrim. To the elves, it was a name of dread. To the men who followed him, it was a name of hope, a beacon in the long march through shadow. The sieges had proven not only their strength, but their endurance, and the shaping of a new dominion had begun. The northern strongholds had fallen, and the snows of Skyrim whispered of the coming storms. With each passing battle, the companions pressed deeper into the land, leaving behind them the smoke of conquered citadels and the silence of broken halls. Yet the heart of Skyrim lay still before them, vast and wild, a realm of jagged peaks and hidden valleys, where rivers thundered through gorges and forests stretched unbroken to the horizon. It was here, in this untamed heart, that the fate of both man and elf would be tested. The march grew harsher. Winter's hand pressed down with unrelenting strength, and the mountains seemed to rise higher with each step. Snow buried the paths, winds cut like blades, and the very breath of the warriors froze upon the air. But the companions endured, for their oaths weighed heavier than the cold. Wrapped in furs, leaning upon one another, they pressed forward like a single body, their torches glowing like distant stars against the endless white. The Snow Elves, though driven from many halls, had not been broken. In the heart of Skyrim, they gathered, fortifying their most sacred places. Ancient temples, carved into living stone, rose from the cliffs like monuments to forgotten gods. Caverns glimmered with crystals that pulsed with magicka, their light reflecting upon walls etched with runes of power. Here the elves prepared their stand, weaving the strength of their ancestors into their defenses. To the companions, these sanctuaries seemed less like fortresses of war and more like sanctums of faith. But even faith could not shield them from vengeance. The battles of the Heartland differed from the sieges of the North. No longer did the elves merely hide behind walls. They struck in coordinated force, pouring from their sanctuaries with the fury of desperation. Clashes erupted in the shadow of mountains, where snow became red with blood. Valleys rang with the cry of steel, and rivers carried away the fallen. The companions met them blow for blow, their shields locking, their voices rising in deep, steady chants. Where one fell, another took his place, for the oath bound them tighter than life itself. Legends tell of a battle upon the banks of a frozen river, where the elves unleashed magics so fierce that the very ice split apart. Frost storms raged, lightning fell from the clouds, and the earth trembled with their wrath. Yet through it all, the companions advanced step by step, shield by shield, their breath steady, their eyes unbroken. When at last they reached the enemy lines, their axes fell with the weight of mountains, and the river ran free once more, carrying both elf and man into its endless depths. At night, when the fires crackled weakly against the biting cold, Ysgramor spoke to his people. He told them of the day Sarthal had fallen, and of the night he had vowed never to rest until justice was won. His words were not filled with rage, but with the steady certainty of stone. He reminded them that they did not march only for vengeance, but for a home that would endure beyond their lives. His voice wove through the dark like a thread of warmth, binding weary hearts to the march yet ahead. And so the companions pressed into the heart of Skyrim, each battle carrying them deeper into legend. The elves fought with all the might of a fading age, their beauty gleaming even in despair. The men of Atmora met them with unyielding resolve, their every step shaping the destiny of a land not yet theirs. Between them, the mountains watched in silence, as though they knew that the tale unfolding upon their slopes would echo through eternity. The companions soon learned that the heart of Skyrim was not merely a place of battle, but a crucible of endurance. Every step demanded sacrifice, every clash drew blood, and every night weighed heavier upon the weary. The 500 had dwindled since their landing upon Tamriel's shores. Where once their ranks had stretched like an unbroken tide, now gaps yawned in their lines, marked by silence and memory. Yet those who remained bore the strength of all who had fallen, carrying their names forward as though they still marched beside them. The Snow Elves, too, had changed. Their numbers lessened with each passing season, yet their desperation grew sharper, their magic fiercer, their blades quicker. In the frozen valleys of Skyrim's heart, they gathered their remaining kin, weaving last defenses with all the brilliance of their fading age. They fought not only for survival, but for the memory of a world they had once ruled. And in that memory, they found a terrible resolve. One of the fiercest battles of this time was fought upon a mountain pass, known in later songs as the Vale of Echoes. There, the elves called upon magics that twisted the very air, sending voices of illusion to confuse the companions. Warriors turned upon their own shadows, thinking them foes. Paths seemed to split and twist, cliffs appearing where none had been, and deep chasms where once lay solid ground. Many stumbled, lost to the illusions, but Ysgramor's shield brothers raised their voices in unison, chanting the oaths of Atmora. Their words cut through the false echoes, guiding their kin back to the path. When the companions struck, they did so with a clarity that shattered the elves' sorcery, and the pass was won with steel and faith alike. But victory bore heavy cost. The frozen ground of the Vale was thick with the fallen, men and mare alike, their bodies left as offerings to the unforgiving snow. The companions did not rejoice, but they lifted their dead upon pyres, flames rising high into the star-scattered sky. Their songs that night were slow and mournful, drifting across the valleys like the wind. For in each death, they saw the price of their oath and the weight of what it meant to carve a home from another's ruin. Still, the march pressed forward. Ysgramor's captains, mighty Ilger, steadfast Jeek of the River, and grim Vrage the Stone Fist, led their war bands with tireless resolve. Each carved tales into the mountains with their deeds. Ilger, who held a narrow bridge against 100 foes until dawn. Jeek, who turned the course of a river to flood an enemy hall. And Vrage, who shattered a crystal tower with a single strike of his axe, earning his name for the strength of that blow. Their legends grew beside that of Ysgramor himself, each a pillar holding the march unshaken. Through storm and battle alike, the companions carved their way into the heart of Skyrim. Villages rose behind them, crude shelters at first, then stronger halls, signs that their dominion was not fleeting but rooted. The elves struck at these outposts in desperation, but the companions held them, for they no longer fought as wanderers. They fought as those laying claim to a homeland. And so, beneath the snowbound peaks and the endless sky, the fate of Skyrim began to take shape. The elves, proud but waning, poured out their strength in defense of a fading age. The companions, scarred but unbroken, pressed onward with the certainty of dawn. Between them, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, for it knew the time was near when one people would rise and the other would fall into shadow. By the time the companions reached the deeper valleys of Skyrim, the land itself seemed steeped in sorrow. The forests whispered with the memory of battles past, rivers carried the echoes of war, and the mountains looked down with ancient, patient silence. The Snow Elves, though driven from many of their strongholds, were not yet broken. In hidden sanctuaries, in caverns aglow with crystalline light, they gathered what strength remained. Here, at the twilight of their dominion, they prepared their last great stands. It is said that these sanctuaries were unlike any other halls in Tamriel. Pillars of glimmering stone rose like frozen dawnlight, and runes carved deep into the walls shimmered with songs of forgotten gods. The air itself seemed to hum with magicka, as though the very earth mourned for the people who had called it home for uncounted ages. To the companions, who had crossed oceans and mountains, these places appeared otherworldly, both beautiful and foreboding. And in their beauty lay tragedy, for each hall was destined to fall beneath the march of Ysgramor's host. The first of these sanctuaries lay in a valley where the snow never melted, no matter the season. The elves had carved their refuge into the cliffs, shaping it with magic so that its walls shimmered as though woven of glass. When the companions approached, they found not silence, but a defense fierce and unyielding. The elves poured from the gates with spells of ice and light, their arrows descending like silver rain. The battle raged for days, fought not only in the valley but upon the cliffs themselves, where warriors grappled upon narrow ledges, each fall carrying them into the abyss. At last, the gates shattered beneath Ysgramor's rams, and the companions surged into the crystalline halls. Within, the elves fought with a desperation beyond measure, their voices rising in mournful songs even as their blades struck true. Many fell, but not without leaving wounds upon their foes. When the hall was finally taken, its shimmering walls cracked and darkened, as if the sanctuary itself grieved its passing. The companions lit their pyres outside the ruined gates, the flames reflected in 1,000 shards of broken crystal. From there, the march pressed on to other sanctuaries, each holding the remnants of a proud and fading people. Some resisted with steel and spell, others sought parley, offering words of peace in exchange for survival. Yet the memory of Sarthel weighed too heavily upon Ysgramor's heart, and his oath left no room for mercy. Each hall, no matter how fair, was claimed in the name of vengeance and the forging of a new homeland. The companions did not rejoice in these victories. Their nights grew quieter, their fires smaller, their songs subdued. They had long since ceased to see themselves as mere avengers. They were now builders, shaping the bones of a future. Yet even builders must first clear the ruins of what came before, and the burden of that truth lay heavy upon them. Thus the twilight of the Snow Elves deepened. Their dominion shrank with each passing season. Their sanctuaries darkened, and their people grew fewer. Still they fought with grace and sorrow, like stars fading against the dawn. And in every clash, in every hall that fell, the companions felt both triumph and grief, for they knew that in ending one age, they bore the weight of beginning another. The twilight of the Snow Elves was not a quiet fading, but a final storm before the night. Word spread swiftly through their scattered kin. Ysgramor and his companions were pressing deeper into the mountains, sanctuaries crumbling one by one. With each defeat, the elves drew together, gathering what strength remained into fewer, stronger holds. They no longer fought to reclaim the land they had lost. That dream had withered. Now they fought to preserve their people, their songs, and the last remnants of their once great dominion. In these days, the battles grew more desperate, more haunting. The elves unleashed magics that had long been hidden from mortal eyes. Some carved the sky itself with light so bright it blinded men for days. Others called forth storms of ice that buried entire warbands beneath avalanches. In one fateful clash, an elven priest shattered the ground of a valley, opening a chasm that swallowed scores of companions into the depths. These were not the measured tactics of rulers. They were the frantic strokes of a people fighting against the tide of inevitability. The companions bore these trials with grim resolve. They had crossed the sea for vengeance, but now found themselves shaping a war of extinction. They did not revel in the slaughter. Each fallen foe was met with silence. Each conquered hall with the quiet recognition that another fragment of Tamriel's ancient tapestry was being torn away. Yet their oaths, spoken in the shadow of Sarthel's ruin, bound them more tightly than pity. They pressed on, for to falter was to dishonor the dead who had brought them this far. Legends speak of Ysgramor himself during these battles, standing always at the front, his great axe Wuthrad gleaming like moonlight against the snow. He did not strike with fury, but with the steady weight of inevitability, each blow a reminder of the oath that had carried them across the frozen sea. His captains, too, became legends. Jeek of the River, who raised a shield to guard Ysgramor when arrows rained from the cliffs. Vrage the Stone Fist, whose laughter could be heard even in the thick of battle. And Ilger, whose songs carried the companions through nights of despair. They were no longer merely warriors. They were living symbols of endurance. Yet the Snow Elves, though pressed to the brink, did not surrender their dignity. In their final halls, they sang songs of ancient glories, voices rising in harmony as they prepared for battle. Their children learned the same melodies, even as the fires of war closed in around them. To the companions, these songs seemed to linger in the air long after the fighting ended, haunting the ruins with echoes of sorrow. Thus the twilight deepened, and both peoples bore its weight. The elves clung to what remained, shining with a beauty all the more tragic for its fragility. The companions pressed forward, scarred and weary, yet unwavering, for they saw beyond the battle to the land that would one day be home. Between them stretched a path of fire and frost, and at its end, the fate of Skyrim waited, silent and patient as the mountains themselves. The years of war had carved deep wounds into the land. Valleys once bright with elven light now lay blackened. Forests smoldered, and mountains bore scars where spells and steel had clashed with unrelenting fury. The Snow Elves, dwindling in number, could no longer scatter their defenses across every sanctuary. Instead, they gathered what remained of their strength into a handful of bastions, places where they swore to make their last and greatest stands. One such bastion lay high upon the cliffs of the northern reaches, a fortress of ice and stone that the elves named Illinar. Its towers shimmered like frozen spears, rising above the clouds, and its gates were carved from solid crystal. From this fortress, the Snow Elves watched the valleys below, awaiting the inevitable march of the companions. They knew that Ysgramor would come, and they prepared not with fear, but with the solemn resolve of those who understand they guard the last spark of their age. When the companions reached Illinar, the approach itself was trial enough. The mountain paths were treacherous, beset with storms that seemed almost conjured by the will of the fortress. Avalanches thundered down upon the climbing warriors, and icy winds tore at their ranks. Yet they pressed on, shields raised, voices carrying oaths across the howling gales. They would not be denied, and when at last they stood before the crystalline gates, they beheld the Snow Elves arrayed in gleaming ranks, their armor glowing like moonlight, their eyes alight with defiance. The battle that followed was among the fiercest of the entire war. The elves rained arrows tipped with frost, each strike chilling flesh to the bone. Sorcerers conjured spears of light that pierced armor as though it were paper. Yet the companions met them blow for blow, their axes ringing against crystal shields, their cries echoing against the frozen cliffs. It was said that the clash shook the very mountain, that the stars themselves dimmed as if to mourn the fury below. Within the fortress halls, fighting raged room by room. Ysgramor himself led the charge, Wuthrad shattering enchanted gates as though they were glass. Beside him fought Jeek of the River, who turned aside a dozen spears with his battered shield, and Vrage, whose booming voice carried commands through the chaos. Though outnumbered, the companions fought with the strength of desperation, for they knew that every victory brought them closer to securing a homeland for their kin. At last, Illinar fell. Its crystal towers cracked, its gates lay shattered, and its defenders lay silent beneath the snow. The companions raised their torches high, the flames reflecting in shards of broken light. Yet there was no joy in the ruin, only silence, for they understood that with each hall that fell, a culture older than memory slipped further into shadow. But Illinar was not the end. Other bastions yet stood, and the Snow Elves gathered there, their hearts unyielding. The war was nearing its final course, and both sides could feel the weight of destiny pressing upon them. The elves would not yield without leaving behind tales of valor, and the companions would not falter until their oath was fulfilled. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the storm that would decide its fate once and for all. The fall of Illinar reverberated across the mountains like the tolling of a bell. For the Snow Elves, it was both a tragedy and a summons. Scattered kin, once resigned to isolation, began to gather in the few strongholds that remained. They understood that their dominion was closing, yet they chose not to fade quietly. Instead, they sought to etch their valor into the memory of the world, so that even if their halls were lost, their courage would linger in song. The last of these strongholds rose in the shadow of the southern peaks, a citadel carved half into the stone and half into the living ice. Its name was lost to time, but its legends endured. Walls of shimmering frost rose higher than any fortress built by men, and wards of ancient power circled its gates. Here the elves called together warriors, priests, and seers from across the land. Families who had fled their ruined sanctuaries gathered here as well, their voices mingling with the chants of battle mages as they prepared for what all knew would be the final reckoning. The companions, weary though they were, did not falter. When word of this last gathering reached Ysgramor, he called his captains to him. "Here," he is said to have spoken, "the war will find its end. Let us meet it as we began, together as one hand." His words bound the companions anew. Though many bore scars, though some limped where once they strode proudly, they tightened their ranks and pressed onward. Their oaths had been forged in blood and grief, and they would not be broken. The march to the citadel was unlike any before. The air itself seemed heavy, as though the world mourned what was to come. Snow fell ceaselessly, cloaking the mountains in silence, and the stars above seemed distant, their light dimmed. Each night, the companions gathered around their fires, not with songs of glory, but with quiet remembrance. They spoke of Sarthel, of those who had fallen, of the long road that had carried them to this brink. Some wept softly their tears freezing upon their cheeks, while others sat in silence, eyes fixed upon the flames. When at last they came within sight of the citadel, they beheld a sight both terrible and beautiful. The towers glowed faintly, lit by magicka woven into their walls. From the battlements, ranks of elven warriors stood in solemn vigil, their armor gleaming like pale fire. The companions felt the weight of that vision, not hatred, but a profound sadness. For they knew that beyond those walls stood a people fighting for their very existence. Yet duty carried them forward. The first clash shook the valley. Elven arrows streaked through the snow, and the companions raised their shields as they charged. Spells lit the sky with colors unnatural, painting the storm with eerie brilliance. The ground trembled with the force of rams and the answering spells that sought to unmake them. For days, perhaps weeks, the battle raged without cease. Neither side yielded easily, and the snows of the valley grew red beneath the weight of their struggle. It was the beginning of the end. Both the Snow Elves and the companions sensed it, though neither dared speak the truth aloud. The war that had begun with the burning of Sarthal was now reaching its final chapter. What remained was not only the clash of steel and spell, but the burden of history itself. The citadel of the Snow Elves, shrouded in storm and silence, stood as the last beacon of a fading age. Around its walls, the companions gathered in a sea of fire and steel, their torches flickering against the white drifts. They had marched across mountains, bled in countless battles, and now found themselves before the threshold of their oath's fulfillment. Yet in their hearts, there was no triumph, only a somber stillness, as though all of Skyrim waited in the hush before dawn. The assault began with a thunder of rams and axes against the gate. For every breach carved, elven sorcery sealed it in frost, and for every spell woven, companions struck it down with steel and fire. The clash raged day into night, until time itself seemed to blur. Warriors fought by torchlight, then by the pale gleam of stars, then by the dim glow of dawn, as if the sun itself had grown weary of rising upon such sorrow. Within the citadel, the Snow Elves fought with unmatched desperation. Priests wove songs of power, their voices echoing through the halls like hymns to forgotten gods. Archers loosed arrows that trailed silver light, while mages conjured storms that split the sky. Families huddled deep within the fortress, listening to the reverberations of battle above them. Many prayed, not for victory, but for remembrance, that their people's story would not vanish entirely, even if their walls fell. The companions pressed on, their ranks thinning yet unbroken. Ysgramor strode at the forefront, Withrad cleaving through wards and shields alike. Around him, his captains bore the marks of countless battles. Jeek of the River's shield split and battered, yet still lifted. Brave's laughter grown hoarse, but unyielding. Ilger's voice cracked with exhaustion, yet still singing to hearten the weary. These warriors were no longer merely men and women of Atmora. They had become the living spirit of Skyrim itself, forged in trial and bound by oath. At last, the gates of the citadel buckled beneath their blows. The companions surged inside, the clash echoing through the crystalline halls. Each chamber became a battlefield, each stair trial. Spells burst against steel, and the cries of the living joined the whispers of the dying. Yet through the chaos, a strange stillness seemed to fall, as if the fortress itself understood its fate. In the heart of the citadel, the final defenders stood, cloaked in white and silver. Their blades gleamed in the flickering light. They did not plead, nor curse their foes. They raised their swords in silence, guardians of a past slipping into shadow. The companions met them with equal silence, for no words could bridge the gulf of sorrow between them. Steel rang, light flashed, and history turned its final page. When it ended, the halls lay still. The torches flickered over shattered crystal and the fallen alike. The Snow Elves' last citadel was broken, its songs silenced. The companions stood amidst the ruin, not in triumph, but in weary reverence. They had fulfilled their oath. Sarthel was avenged, Skyrim reclaimed. Yet as they looked upon the quiet halls, they knew that with the victory came a loss that would echo through the ages. The silence after the final battle lingered like a shroud. Snow drifted through the shattered gates of the citadel, settling upon stone and steel alike. The companions stood among the ruins, their breath rising in pale clouds, their bodies weary yet unbowed. They had come to Skyrim as exiles, had marched across mountains and rivers, and now stood as its claimants. Their vengeance was fulfilled, yet the weight of that fulfillment pressed heavily upon their hearts. For as they looked upon the fallen halls, they knew that more than enemies had perished. A people, ancient and proud, had slipped into shadow. Their songs would fade, their towers crumble, and their names be carried only in whispers. The companions had reclaimed their homeland, but they had also witnessed the closing of an age. And in that twilight, Ysgramor spoke softly to his warriors. "We have carved our place, but let us not forget what was lost, for memory shapes the soul as surely as steel shapes the blade." With the war ended, the companions spread across the land. They raised halls where once there had been only ruin, building homes, farms, and villages. From the stones of the fallen citadel, they laid the foundations of new lives. Fires were kindled where once icy silence ruled, and the laughter of children echoed across valleys once drowned in sorrow. Skyrim began to breathe again, and its dawn rose upon fields no longer stained with battle. Yet the legacy of the war endured. Songs were sung of Sarthel's fall, of the march of 500 across snow and sea, of battles that shook the mountains and citadels that gleamed like moons upon the earth. Around the hearth fires, elders told the names of the captains who had stood beside Ysgramor, and children listened wide-eyed, their hearts stirred by tales of valor and grief. Thus the story passed into legend, and legend into the very bones of Skyrim. But Ysgramor himself carried the weight of memory. In his hall at Whiterun, he would sit long into the night, his hands resting upon Wuthrad, his gaze distant. He spoke little of triumph, more often of duty, and sometimes of sorrow. To those who asked of the Snow Elves, he would answer with quiet words. They fought as we fought, with love for their kin and the land beneath their feet. Remember this, and do not let pride blind you to the truth of the world. His wisdom became a guidepost, though not all would heed it in the centuries that followed. In time, the companions themselves grew into something greater than warriors. They became a brotherhood bound not only by bloodshed, but by honor, remembrance, and the bonds of fellowship. Their halls would stand for generations, a living echo of the oath sworn when Sarthel burned. And though the years would veil their deeds in myth, the essence of their journey endured, that from loss can rise resilience, from grief can rise unity, and from silence can rise song. Thus did Skyrim's dawn break upon a land forever changed. The Snow Elves faded into legend, the Atmorans became Nords, and the companions remained as the living memory of both triumph and tragedy. The story of Ysgramor and the 500 companions was not merely a tale of conquest, but of becoming, a reminder that even in victory, the shadows of the past linger, shaping the path of those yet to come. And so the tale closes, not with a shout of triumph, but with a whisper carried on the northern wind, a whisper of Tamriel, where the echoes of past ages murmur softly, guiding dreamers into sleep and reminding all who listen that history is never lost, only waiting to be remembered.